what is the problem with cities today and how can we fix it? As urban populations rise, quality of life in cities seems to drop. Is density, therefore, at the expense of livability? Are nature and cities both key to our survival, at odds with each other? And if they're not, how do we bridge the gaps? How does it affect what I do at the drawing board? And what will the future city look like? Welcome to Ecogradia, where we meet experts and practitioners at the front lines of sustainable architecture and urbanism. My name is Nirmal Krishnani. I'm a sustainable design strategist, author, and educator based in Singapore. My guests on this first episode of Ecogradia are Wong Summ and Richard Hassell, co-founding directors of the award-winning Singapore firm WOHA, certainly two of the best-known and most progressive practitioners in Asia. In case you've not heard of WOHA, or Google the name, many remarkable projects will pop up. Munson and Richard have a new book out, WOHA, New Forms of Sustainable Architecture. Now, this is a sequel to Garden City, Megacity, published in 2016. I am very interested in what they bring to the conversation, that density can be a good thing, that cities and nature are not on opposing sides. Architecture, even when profit-seeking, can be generous. It can be home to all life, not only ours. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the projects discussed or would like to know more about some of the ideas and people mentioned in this interview, go to ecogradia.com to view notes, pictures, and links that we have compiled on the episode page. This first season of Ecogradia is sponsored by the Summ Foundation for Sustainable Construction. The foundation was created in 2003 to empower a community of changemakers through the transfer of ideas, knowledge, and real-world solutions. Next year, we'll see the start of a new cycle of the Summ Awards, for which Munsum, Richard, and I have all been jurors. Go to wholesomefoundation.org to find out more. Munsum, Richard, welcome. Now, WOHA was formed in 1994 in Singapore, almost 3 decades ago, but you met some years before that. Let's talk about that. Starting with you, Munsum, where did you grow up and where did you study architecture?
I grew up in Singapore and I studied at National University of Singapore from 1983 to 1989. And then I was an intern at Carey Hill Architects and William Lim Associates. But after graduation, Carey Hill asked me to join him again. So I started working for him in 1989, 1990. And I think Richard joined us in 1990.
Now, Carey Hill Architects is an award-winning firm with offices in Singapore and Australia that was founded by the late Carey Hill, and it's a firm that's well known for its residential and resort architecture. Richard, you grew up and you were trained in Perth, Australia, yes?
Yes, I'm from Perth in Western Australia.
So why did you move to Singapore?
I actually moved to Singapore because there were no jobs for architects in Australia at the time I graduated. It was one of the worst recessions in the industry. But I'd actually already decided that architecture wasn't for me, so I sort of decided to travel the world, and then I had a vague plan to further my art studies. But I happened to get a phone call just after graduating from my aunt who lives in Singapore, and she had just met at lunch an architect's wife, and the wife had been saying, "Oh, my husband can't get anyone to work for him, he's really busy." And she said, "Oh, my nephew just graduated last week, so maybe you should talk." And it turned out to be Carey's wife, Ruth. Not that they were friends, it was really they'd met for the first time. But I got on the phone to Carey, or Carey got on the phone to me, I can't remember which. It turned out Carey had been to my university and he was friends with my professor. So next thing I knew, I was on a plane up to Singapore. And some of you were wrong, it was 1989 that I came up. But right at the end, December 1989, that I came to Singapore.
Oh, 1990 that you start work, 1st of January. It was actually quite funny. When Richard walked in, I just burst into laughter.
That's because I was wearing a tie and a jacket and thinking that's what people wore.
No one wears a tie and jacket in Singapore.
So I was this total greenhorn wearing this tie and jacket, and immediately a figure of ridicule.
You were not trained in the ways of the tropics yet.
No, I was very inappropriately dressed. Maybe that was the first lesson in designing for climate.
Now, so you guys worked at Cherry Hill for a couple of years. Why did you decide to leave and set up your own practice?
Well, I think at that point we'd been through many project design cycles because it was quite speculative, the work. And Summ had a project complete, so he'd seen it through from one end to the other. And at that point, because the work, particularly at that time, was really 100% resort hotels, we sort of felt we knew the genre. We'd experimented and explored with a lot of ways of doing it, and it felt a little like more of the same in the future. At the same time, we had ideas already, I think, about climate and sustainability and finding a contemporary expression for doing that. And in some ways, the critical regional approach felt a little bit limiting at that point.
We also felt that it was necessary for us to build in our backyard. And in Cherry Hill Architect, most of the work were overseas. And the first project I did, the Datai Langkawi, from master planning to finishing it off, was a great experience for me. And we felt it was time for us to build our own backyard, but I didn't realize at that time it was this urge to contribute to Singapore and also the city.
WOHA today, how big is it? What are the kinds of projects you do? What's your portfolio look like?
We are currently about 100 people, and it's a size that we are very comfortable with. We still do very small projects, but we also do very large projects as well, and complicated ones. At any one time, we have about 10 to 15 projects. And we do have a criteria, and we select our projects. It's one that is there's a possibility for us to bring civic and public good to the project, and that there must be a potential for it to be transformative in that context, in that city, and that attached to it is a very strong message that we think is necessary to rethink buildings and rethink cities.
Cities, in fact, are very central to the conversation that you're trying to have. In fact, in your work and your writings, you often make a case for the kind of urbanism that we need today. Specifically, you challenge the assumptions that frame the conversation on cities ongoing. So your critique of planning is that it starts with the city in plan view, looking down, creating hard edges and monofunctional zones, that the boundary between building and city is sharp, often marked by roads. And in your work, therefore, you counter this approach with what you call 3D planning, the city seen from a sectional perspective as a set of vertically stacked and interdependent layers. So let's unpack this idea for a minute. What is so problematic about the current planning model, and what specifically does 3D planning achieve?
We think the old 2D cities split by functions, divided by circulation networks, it actually did what it wanted to do very well. It's just that the criteria for success maybe now are quite different. And so it's not so much that it didn't work, but it worked very, very well. And it answered a question that is now a question nobody's asking. And so the sort of new questions about how do we create regenerative cities, or cities that perform much, much better on a range of criteria, how do we design them? And I think the real difficulty is that this 20th century city has been enshrined in regulation and master planning in such a way that it is quite difficult to unpick and quite difficult to imagine, frankly. So a lot of what we've been working on is imagining if we were to start and answer today's questions, what would that city look like? What would its components be? And definitely the three-dimensional aspect, I think, is a crucial one, because separating things in two dimension by function is not a way you can get sort of productive adjacencies or make the most effective use of of what's happening in the world three-dimensionally, such as, the energy being rained down on our city from above. That's something that the 20th century city never even contemplated.
We think that it's necessary for us now to start thinking about the future of mobility. The future of mobility is not going to be what we have today. It will change drastically. It will be autonomous. It will be shared. It will be on demand. It will be flying drones. It will be underground drones. I think it will be very diverse, also very inclusive. And I think we are so sort of fixated with what we have now, which is the vehicle driven by human beings and private cars. And this is limiting the way we are looking at the future. So in terms of the three-dimensional planning that we are thinking about, it's really about moving with time, moving with technology, which are current, but to a point where we can catch up in terms of policies, city planning, and guidelines that would evolve with the change as well.
What does the 21st century look like, or what should it look like? In what ways does it feel and look different from what we experience today?
We're really interested in how we can shrink the footprint of the city to much closer match the actual extent of the city. Because I think a lot of the problems going on in the world are not actually, the problems are not in the city. The problem is what the city is doing to the rest of the world in terms of extracting resources and diverting basically everything into a machine that feeds the city. So a key thing we want to look at is how to shrink that footprint, and then that becomes something that starts shaping what the city might look like. So, the basic level of all life on Earth dependent on the solar energy raining down. What are we going to use that energy for? Are we going to convert it to electrical energy? Are we going to use it for growing food? Those are sort of decisions and trade-offs that would affect how a 21st century might look. So this idea of a sort of self-sufficient regenerative city means totally reorganizing where the elements go in such a way to make it far more efficient and less wasteful. And to us, it's very exciting because it means we need all new forms of organization and three-dimensional forms and expression of our buildings to achieve that aim.
We need to conceive of a vertical 15-minute city. It's definitely more compact. It's not spread out. And that we need to think about vertical zoning and stacking of users, multiple ground levels, multiple users, multiple owners and stakeholders. And think of it as almost like a three-dimensional ancient snake and ladder board game. And that's how people move. But one thing that we must also emphasize is that we are very much into being biocentric, where we consider ourselves part of nature, and that it's necessary for us to be sustainable and resilient in our way we do things.
A lot of what you say is underpinned by the idea that we have to also change the way we think about architecture, because you have very deliberately linked the future of the city to the future of the way we think about architecture. In fact, here's a quote from your book, your new book. WOHA understood that the underlying methodology for architecture had reached a point where they were obliged to extend their ideas beyond the limits of an individual structure. They wanted to reshape the networks and systems of a city. You, in fact, go on to argue that buildings should seek to engage and transform urban systems, and that multiple buildings should come together to form new networks. You call this macro-architecture, micro-urbanism. So give us an example of this in action. How do buildings come together to form these larger wholes? What is this whole that you're aspiring to when you start to reinvent the typologies of the buildings, anticipating the morphology of the city? What is that thing that you're aiming for?
I think I would like to use Kampong Admiralty as example, primarily because this project is a fairly complex one that involves quite many stakeholders, 4 ministries, and it was conceived as 4 separate briefs that we integrated as one. We were able to create a village for the elders, a park for the community, conceived as a small hill, also performing as ecosystem services. Then we have a major public space, which we term it as a covered tropical plaza for the community. And then yet on top of that, we were able to layer on a community farm, medical and support facilities for the community, but all stacked up vertically in a building.
So just to clarify, so Kampong Admiralty is a mixed-use public building in the midst of a public housing estate in Singapore, right? And it was completed a few years ago in 2017. So this thing that you're talking about, this club sandwich architecture that you're describing, is basically a way of stacking the programs of the building, but introducing within that new systems like public space and parks and biodiversity and farms. So it's kind of like the snake and ladder game that you were describing. It's architecture kind of vertically stacked and creating this vertical movement. Yeah, is that about right?
Yes, that's correct. And what we were looking at was beyond the site boundaries itself. We felt that there was something very lacking in that community, in that district or that area. And also from a standpoint of that project, it was during a time where elderly housing was seen as something not desirable in your neighborhood. And that we felt it was so necessary for us to embrace all this negativity and turn into a very positive statement in the project.
So the microurbanism comes in because this building acts as a node in that urban network, both in terms of converging public spaces into this big plaza, but also the roof acting as a kind of a biodiversity hotspot where it kind of becomes a place where other forms of life can congregate. So it kind of has a ripple effect on where it is. It's transformative, not just within itself, but to the neighborhood at large.
Also, I think the microurbanism concept refers to the way you experience the building. You don't feel like you're entering a building, taking a lift or an escalator and going to a functional room. It's a cluster of private, semi-private, public spaces, and the way you move around it is really quite urban. You have a destination in a park, for instance. You have to use vertical transportation to get there, but you don't feel like you've left the public realm behind. You're still in the public realm when you're within this three-dimensional environment. So yeah, it's both a node as well as a way of thinking about how these mega structures function. They're not just big buildings, they're actually three-dimensional chunks of a city.
What is really interesting is that recently there was a study and a research done on the movement of people, and it was one of the things that validated our ideas was that people in a vertical city did not necessarily need to come down to the ground. So you will have these elders who will be living in their housing, would go to the park, which is the Sky Park on the top of the building, and they will go to the community farm, and they'll go to the medical center, and they will go to the food court, which is what we call in Singapore a hawker center. But they never actually, in the entire week, come down to the ground level.
You also found that there were other forms of life who decided to make Kampong Admiralty their home. There was an audit on biodiversity. And what did that show?
What was really interesting is that I think with almost 1 hectare in site area, we were able to create more than twice the amount of biodiversity as one that was just adjacent in a nearby park that's on the ground. And it proved that it's a sort of a vegetated landscape in a building can actually have the same amount of urban diversity as one on the ground level. I think this was an interesting revelation to us, and something that has, I think, got impact in terms of how we see cities and how we plan cities.
But double the biodiversity, that's quite remarkable compared to a adjacent park. Was this the result of plant selection? Was that something that you were doing on the rooftop of this building that the park wasn't doing on the ground?
Yes, so it was actually designed for biodiversity as a conscious outcome. And I think that really shows, the power of design to really affect outcomes. The local park, which was less diverse, had not been designed for biodiversity. It had been designed for humans and for ease of maintenance, so it didn't have that many species. They were mature trees, they were on the ground, but they were not very productive, while the species selected for the park, were flowering and fruiting species, and they were very biodiverse. But I think what was really astonishing was how quickly nature found it. It wasn't particularly well connected to any other biodiversity around it, and yet the birds and the insects and the beetles and everything really just found their way incredibly quickly and happily made it their home.
So this is actually a very small building. I know you've described it as an example of macro-architecture, micro-urbanism, but it's actually not a big building. What amplification can you see this with larger projects? I mean, if you have multiple buildings as part of a single master plan, what does this idea potentially offer? I mean, take your Punggol Digital District as a case study. So the Punggol Digital District is a business park master plan in the north of Singapore, and it's an ongoing construction. You described it as having 10 buildings. Could you give me a sense of the size of the footprint of this master plan? How many hectares are we talking about?
The master plan and the buildings that are being executed are almost to an area of 1 square kilometer, with a height limit of 60 meters, because it's actually quite near a sort of a aeroport. One of the key difference in this master plan and this development as compared to Kampong Admiralty, where we felt was a fairly individual, single building and small scale development, was this aggregation of all these buildings together. We were able to implement 3 new stratums in this that makes it quite impactful from a social and from a mobility and sustainable point of view. It's this subterranean structure that connects all the buildings together and future phases and developments in the vicinity and the area together. We also have this elevated, interconnected urban network where people can move around from building to building without actually touching ground. We call this the collaboration network, primarily because it was a business park and an educational institution. And then we have on top, we conceive of a solar canopy, and below this solar canopy, we were pushing for a commercial food farm of vegetables. This is something that we were pushing, but we're still pushing. We are piloting parts of it at the moment, but it hasn't been scaled up to the impact that we envision. Same with the solar canopy, but nevertheless, it's something I think has been seeded in the project, and I think everyone is interested in seeing the results of it.
So the micro-urbanism, as you expand from single to multiple buildings, allows you to create these additional connections, these additional networks in the neighborhood, in the city, at these 3 levels. There is this uppermost tier, which connects buildings together with solar canopies and farms. You've got the basement, which is where your mobility is shifted to. And then you've got this podium level movement, which allows people to move from building to building without touching the ground. That in a nutshell, is where the microurbanism leads you from a city planning point of view, right?
Yeah, so in a way, what it's done, the multiple ground levels has created 4 neighborhoods, or even 5, I think, because we didn't mention the beautiful ground level as well, which we still have, of course. So there's 5 neighborhoods stacked on top of each other, which, in a traditional city would have taken 5 square kilometers to have all these different elements. So you have a sort of a logistics hub, you have the ground level with all kinds of non-private car mobility, walking, cycling, connection to the train station, connection to a bus station. Then there's the collaboration loop, so that's like a street through a university and business district, and then the roof is really almost a rural district, if you would see it as like agricultural production and solar farm. So that's where you can really, I think, start to see the potential. I think the other thing is that suddenly there's no pressure on the ground as in terms of amenity. Like normally you would say in a dense business park district, the ground floor would be covered with loading docks and so many lobbies, substations, all kinds of services, fire services, things like that. So they've been to a large extent relocated out of that plane, and suddenly it's a little utopian in a way, that we have a big patch of rainforest surrounded by social spaces as the experience of the ground level.
I'd like to pause a minute to remind listeners that you can view each project discussed here at ecogradient.com. There, you'll also find notes and links that will help you get more out of this episode so that you are better informed. Now, this is the hope that I share with the EcoGradient team and with the episode sponsor, the Summ Foundation for Sustainable Construction. Inviting the foundation to support this podcast was really one of the easiest decisions I made. They backed me when my books came out. In turn, I have been a past Wholesome Awards ambassador. I've been on the awards regional jury twice. So we have a shared history. But this collaboration now is more than a question of continuity and convenience. The foundation's goals are perfectly aligned with EcoGradients. We both want to be signposts on the road to a better future. Over the years, I personally have learned much from the many experts, practitioners, and students that make up its global community. I wish the same for my listeners. So do visit the Foundation's website, wholesomefoundation.org. It is a window to the world of sustainable design and construction, a place to find useful ideas and points of view. You've consistently made the case that hyperdensity and livability are not at odds. And I think you talked a little bit about the strategies for getting there, but maybe if you could walk us through the process, maybe with a project or something that illustrates how density and livability are negotiated when you have these very high densities. Hong Kong, for example, has peak densities in excess of 120,000 people per square kilometer. It makes perfect sense from a sustainability discourse. You get great utilization of transportation corridors. You're able to, conserve large blocks of nature. Other cities which have very high livable rating may not have these peak densities. They may be 30,000 or less. Talk us through the design process of thinking that you have here between density and livability.
Richard, we should talk about Duxton Plain competition. I think that's an important one that started us thinking about it.
Yeah. So in the year 2000, I think it was, we took part in a competition for Duxton Plain public housing, which ended up as the project The Pinnacle, which was a very nice design by Arc Studio in Singapore. But it was quite a confronting project in a way. It was putting, I think it was 1,800 homes into a 3-story heritage district in a 50-story building. And so it had the kind of brief that excited us because, on one level it seemed a kind of act of violence against the district. And in another aspect, it really made sense. You could have a whole lot of new families come and invigorate the area. It's a fantastic place to live. And so for us, then it became, the question there was, how do we create environment in this new, very large construction that had the humane qualities of the streets of Chinatown. And so we took it as really quite a proportional strategy that, the streets had a certain dimension. They were about 18 meters high and 18 meters wide, and there was good, visual contact between people in the buildings across the street. And so we thought, well, can't we just create a whole stack of environments that had similar qualities to the streets of Chinatown, and literally just stack them up one on top of the other, and even better, they didn't need roads, so rather than being streets, they could be parks and gardens, and we could basically then have a very nice array of very well proportioned and friendly districts, and that was quite a game changer for us, because it really we realized we could manufacture as much amenity as we wanted, if there was a will, and if there was a budget. And I think it's always been something where, in the hands of developers, they say they can't afford to do these things. But if you look at the big picture, how much does it cost to build roads and water and drains for a community of 1,800 homes, outside the city, in a more traditional city where you would have the suburbs, and how much do you spend on the freeways, bringing all the cars out to that place, or on the new train line? And so if you compared those enormous infrastructure costs with the quite small cost of adding a 18-meter floor slab of a park, it's actually incredibly cheaper to create amenity within structures than to build it kilometers away on the outskirts of the city.
Actually, what let us down at that time, that was the turn of the century, right, was technology a little bit. Well, one of the criticism of our scheme was that it was compelling, but we didn't have substantiation for whether the spaces were livable, they were pleasant. We couldn't simulate the kind of daylight quality, the kind of environments that we're creating for the people. So, but things have changed since. We have better tools, we have better equipment to validate some of this prognosis, and I think if we are to do it now, it's easy, but which we have done through a Skyview. We have reused a lot of these ideas into a project and implemented and built to very good results as well.
Skyville is a 1,000 apartment development.
960.
960 to be exact. 960 apartment development, public housing development in Singapore. I just want to talk about this idea of big, that big is better. that in essence is what you're saying, that as long as it can also deliver a positive human experience, that big is actually better for the city. But you don't hear this very often, do you, in design circles? In fact, I would go so far as to say that there is an aversion to the idea of bigness in the sustainability movement. And this holds us back from having a serious conversation about the future of cities. Why do you think the design community recoils from the idea of big? Mega structures and mega cities. Is that something that goes against the grain of how we see architecture and planning today?
It's an interesting question, because, many modern cities are enormous, but they're just spread two-dimensionally. So I think as long as things are out of the field of view, we don't perceive them as being so big. And so I think one psychological problem with megastructures is you actually suddenly can perceive how big developments actually are, when in fact they may be no different to a suburb or something like that. If you fly over Perth, where I'm from, and see a new suburb, it kind of freaks me out, because there's just nothing but a sea of roofs almost touching. It's like a terracotta district, and with hardly a tree or anything to be seen. But that's not your experience on the ground. So I think one thing is that visibility issue. Another one, I think, is big things make us think of big institutions running them, and it just feels, maybe as a human, you feel overwhelmed. You're a tiny cog in a huge machine, and so you worry, I guess, that your voice will be irrelevant, and you're at the mercy of the large organizations which will deliver such a large building. But I think it's largely kind of psychological, because these enormous organizations are doing these things, whether the city's two-dimensional or three-dimensional. And our power and our water and our food, everything is totally reliant on huge infrastructures and organizations that deliver it to us.
But the reality is that all these cities are very complex problems. And again, it's the acceleration of these cities and mega cities in the last 50 years to 75 years. I mean, in 1950, we only had two mega cities, right? We only had New York and we have Tokyo. Both are excellent mega cities. But it's only this acceleration in the last 50 to 75 years that has caused all these mega cities to be sort of evolved and exploded in such a big mess. And I think there were not much appreciation of how the city should grow, and not enough lessons learned. I mean, if you look at the mega cities in the world, you have Chinese ones, which are based on 20th century model, basically Western import models. And the rest of the other ones are very organic growth. They just grew larger because of acceleration of population, without much planning and thinking about it. Both models didn't quite work as well. But the interesting nature of it is that all the cities are now 25 to 50 years old. They are now going through a period of rejuvenation itself. And this is such a good time to talk about how cities should be evolving and being planned for a more sustainable future.
A big part of what you argue in terms of the livability aspect of cities is the presence of nature, isn't it? And this is where you kind of contest the other assumption about planning, which is that you can't have hyperdense mega cities that are alive with thriving ecosystems. This is an assumption that you challenge. The last title of your book, Garden City, Mega City, by its very title, explicitly refutes this assumption. In fact, you argue that bringing the two together is in fact the way forward towards addressing both population growth and global warming. Now, I want to find illustrations of this idea of how nature and density can coexist. And the project that comes to mind right off the bat is WOHA Hotel Downtown. Now, this is if I may say, a shocking illustration of what high density and dense nature looks like. So this commercial mixed-use tower is in the heart of the Singapore business district. It's got a very small footprint, but it's 190 meters high. So it's this pencil-thin skyscraper. It's punctuated vertically with 3 semi-outdoor atria that are vegetated, but it's covered in this red mesh that is the substrate for vegetation. It's one of the largest green wall installations in Singapore, I suspect anywhere, and it's a spectacular display that's very rarely seen in a city. The numbers are amazing. WOHA Hotel Downtown has a green plot ratio of 1,100%. Now that is a metric which means that the total surface area of greenery is 11 times the site area. Why has greenery, and vertical greenery in particular, become so important to this discussion on cities? Isn't it enough that we emphasize on parks and natural areas on the ground? Why does it have to go vertical?
I think we see greenery as really important psychologically in high-density environments. There's something extremely exhausting about your field of vision filled with the products of humans. They're so loaded with sociological meaning, the style, when they were built, are they well maintained? Are they attractive? If it's ugly, it's because someone put that ugly thing in front of your face. So there's a kind of a confrontational aspect. While when you look at greenery across the street, it's immediately soothing, relaxing. It's makes you think of health and wellness, and things growing, things that are generating clean air. So I think that, it's a really critical aspect to not making the mega city seem dystopian. And I think one of our terms in the book you mentioned, Garden City Megacity, was the domesticated megastructure. And we see that as really important, that when you look at it almost like a landscape rather than an object. So it's not some hard, shiny, sophisticated, expensive object that other people sort of own and have possession of, and they may or may not want you to go there. Instead, it seems like a district. You can sort of see clusters of nice places to be. You can see landscape and trees, birds and animals, the wind's moving through it, the light's moving through it. It's a kind of three-dimensional environment that looks really pleasant, and that is really very different from a great big building covered with granite.
But maybe some facts. It's only 45 meters by 45 in terms of a site area. So it's really like a New York skyscraper typology. The distance between our building to the next building is actually no more than 20 to 25 meters. It is really close. So I think this was something that came to mind when we were looking at this particular site in Singapore. Is this what would we see as a tropical equivalent of a building in New York? Bear in mind, in New York, buildings are equally close together, but hey, there's still no joy in looking across, except if you really want to see what people are doing. But just in terms of building performance, if you take an infra thermometer and point towards WOHA Hotel downtown, the facades as compared to Tanjong Pagar Center, which is glass, steel, and granite, it is almost half the temperature. It's about 25 to 30 degrees as compared to 45 to 50 degrees for the Tanjong Pagar. The surface temperature is almost half. This is so important from a urban hidden island effect, and also from thinking about how we need to evolve and plan cities. Not only that, too, we've got experts to measure the ecosystem services that the building contributes. If you compare this to a lowland rainforest, it produces 30% of what this lowland rainforest will, in terms of regulating temperature, air pollution, and the temperature of the place. So it's
for the same size of footprint.
For the same size. So if you think about it, if this building was 3 times as tall, 3 times as much green and all that, we would have replicated a rainforest. Even though this is a building itself, a built hard building, we have able to replicate a rainforest. So the implication is that if the cities have to be a high density, high rise, think about nature, think about what nature can do for us and for the planet, providing ecosystem services. Maybe we won't have to feel that bad about building cities, going a high, creating environment for humans. We are equally looking after nature and the planet.
I take my students every year to see WOHA Hotel downtown, and the majority of them will start off totally blown away. They'll be amazed by it. And then the questions start to trickle in. And these are the pragmatic architects who are asking themselves, how do I sell this? Is this too expensive to construct? Is it too hard to maintain? What if all the plants die? What is my liability as a consultant, if this massive green wall fails in 10 years? I think these are pragmatic, but they are important as well. And I was wondering what your experience has been with this project since it opened.
Actually, one more point I wanted to add too was that when we're doing this project, we were quite specific about what kind of animals we wanted to allow to come into the building. It was climbing animals. We have always been able to succeed with sky gardens where animals and insects that would fly could actually land on the sky gardens and the terraces. But we have never been able to get squirrels, for example, to be able to climb up to all our sky garden terraces. And what is really nice is that on the, I think the 10th or 11th floor is where we have the hotel sky gardens and terrace, the hotel lobby. The general manager told us that every morning they would see some squirrels, and it's such a good validation of the fact that if you design it, the animals will come. And I think this is such a nice little story feedback that we've got. But back to your point. Well, we work with the same budget. One thing we didn't do was to build an extensive basin. We thought that the car parking services could be above ground, and that they could be part of the whole exaggerating the fact that the tower could be taller. You could have more greenery clad to around it. So we didn't think that burying it in the ground, committing it to a lifetime of mechanical ventilation and lighting would be a good thing, but maybe put it up where we have natural ventilation and natural lighting. So this is something that we felt was a good sustainable move. The other thing too is that we did think about the long term, whether or not the landscape would suffer in the hands of people who've got blue-black thumbs. It did happen during the pandemic. Due to the lockdown and due to the fact that there was lack of care to the plants, the landscaping did degenerate a little bit. But we were able to highlight it early enough to the clients to try and rescue it. But the fact is, when we designed this, we thought it was necessary to give it very good undergarments. So if the plants die, the rate was still going to be very nice to look at, So we think that we had a backup plan. If plants don't grow well, it's still going to look like a fantastic building.
And in fact, the red is a bit like a danger signal. So if the plants are not doing well, the building gets redder and redder and redder as it loses green, sort of like flashing danger, and so we thought that was quite cool as well.
Yeah, it was always thought of that the rate would be like accents, like flowers in a landscape. So ideally, it was all green with just spots of green, with spots of a red. So, but when that happens, when it's not well kept, the reverse would happen.
We actually introduced the idea, Nirmal, of a chief plant officer, which I have to say we haven't been very successful at implementing it, but we think every developer that creates a building with a lot of landscape should have a chief plant officer, because it's just not in the general C-suite's purview.
We have all this terminology: CLO, Chief Landscape Officer, CDO's Chief Design Officer.
But we think
there's just new economies and new jobs that we're creating.
Yes, and so because we realized that even within our own firm, if an architect is good at keeping a pot plant alive on their desk, they kind of understand plants and they can design for plants. The people who kill a little pot plant on their desk are probably going to not design a good sky garden either, because it's really about having empathy and understanding for what the plants need to survive. And then so you need that in the management of the building as well.
I think a year or two ago, they spotted a pair of Himalayas vultures at the very top, playing around, And it's the very fact that we sort of had such rare species of animals and birds was quite startling.
And very Batman in a way, to have this bright red tower with bald Himalayan vultures, and they were actually mating on the building.
Making out, yes.
I want us to take a look back at your journey. Yeah, you evolved from a practice that focused on small private residential projects in the 90s to these larger, more urban and public developments in the 2000s. And now we see these master plans that embrace, ideas about this future city at all scales and all systems. I want to see if we can identify the tipping points from one stage to the next. I mean, for instance, you had a really successful run with the private home. And then suddenly, out of the blue, you pushed the brakes on that, rejected new commissions, and turned your attention to high-rise projects and public work. Well, that must have been lunacy at that time. It must have seemed incredibly risky for you as a successful practice to shut down your lifeline. Why did you make that shift?
I think our ambitions have always been more than being a sort of handmaiden to the wealthy, delivering them the lifestyles they desire. But it's extraordinary how much that's a kind of vortex of effort. It seems no matter what you do, you end up designing a luxury bathroom for somebody. And for us, that was terribly frustrating. And so we could see it as a kind of trap that the more successful you get in that market, the more it in a way corrupts you, because it offers you access to beautiful materials and like larger spaces and things. So from a point of view of the aesthetics of design, it's very seductive. But in the end, you sort of feel like you've just been enabling consumption. You haven't addressed any of the big issues. And also, we just had this sense that there were these huge and interesting problems to solve, and no one really seemed to be tackling them. If they were being tackled at a very kind of engineering level, and seemed to be the antithesis of the the traditional architectural values of commodity firmness and delight. There was maybe a bit of firmness there, but no delight. And we were really interested, I think, in is like what new forms of delight comes from these new requirements that we need to solve.
When did the word sustainability enter your vocabulary? I mean, was there a moment when you started talking about sustainability, or was that an idea that evolved from earlier positions? I'm thinking now, of course, that it's a continuum, right? We had the energy efficiency issues in the 80s. We had tropical thinking in the 90s, and then came green. And so this has always been a continuum of thinking along the lines of performance-based architecture. When did sustainability entrench itself in your thinking?
We were both educated in the 80s. And I think that came after the 70s oil crisis. And I think there was this resurgence of, I think at the time was called environmental science. So it was something that was really sort of ingrained in us, in our education. And the moment we practiced, it was something that was second nature to us. Even for when we were working in Carrier Architects, even the hotels that we're doing, for me, the Data in Langkawi, it was all about conserving nature, minimizing the impact of nature, how we could actually enjoy nature, breezes, natural ventilation, smell the forest, see the birds and the insects go by. It was all part of the education we had. And maybe also partly because of our upbringing, we separately, we always enjoyed nature to a certain extent. And I think it came very natural to us. But the way we talk about sustainability only evolved, I think, with the pressing problems that we are having.
I think, though, Manson, we were coming from science backgrounds and being quite interested always, I guess, in the big picture, was that we were aware of global warming and the coming crisis in the 90s for sure. I mean, my father was a bit of a prepper in a way, but also really interested in innovation. So he developed solar air conditioning for his business in the late 70s with the Solar Energy Research Institute of Western Australia. So it was a total concentrating, tracking solar collectors on the roof. We brought my primary school year 6 or 7 class to see it on a class excursion, I remember. And then built a totally off the grid house in 83, I think. So it was just that in the 70s and 80s, it was more like a world without fossil fuels. The fuel crisis had made it seem like there was about to be a long-term shortage of fossil fuels, so people needed to be energy efficient and go off grid. And that slowly segued into the environmental crisis through the 80s and 90s. I think it was Al Gore's movie, Inconvenient Truth, that really sort of made the issue burst out into the public realm. But that movie was based on a very long conversation that had happened in the decade before.
I think it's an interesting point you raised that sustainability is sort of segued into a broader discussion of ethics and responsibility in design, which was there all along, and it may have been perhaps had different areas of focus prior to the green movement and the coalescing of the word sustainability, but the idea of ethics and performance has always been there. And for those of you who were interested in responsible design, this came naturally. Now, I want to look back at this journey that you've had, and I want to ask you how much of it was intent and how much of it was just sheer luck. Because one of the things that strikes me is that in that time when you gave up the private residential projects and you went into design competitions, basically, you were bidding for projects like a high-rise residential tower or an underground MRT station, mass rapid transit station in Singapore, and you had no prior track record in any of that. Now, would that happen today? I mean, I'm just curious as to how much of what you went through was you being focused on a goal, and how much of it was stuff that happened to you?
I think there's no such thing as luck in our career. So if we had luck, we would have won all the competitions we took part in, but we certainly did not.
I think there's such a thing of timing, though, right? Because it was actually very critical that the Public Works Department in Singapore was disbanded at that time, and suddenly a whole range of typologies of projects which were previously not available to the private sector were starting to be tendered out. And so what was interesting was no one had a track record. So the fact that we were two guys who were really good at luxury bathrooms,
that's not true.
Didn't really.
That's not true.
Wasn't
Richard.
a disadvantage.
That's not true with the circular line competition, which is the 2 MRT station. It was an international competition. It was, but the good thing that when it was organized, they didn't require a track record. It was an open competition. 400 entries around the world, including Norman Foster, Zaha Hadid, you name the big names, they all took part in it. So I think that was a very well organized, very fair, and very well adjudicated competition. Whether there's any luck involved in that, I'm not quite sure, but we were told they were completely blown away, completely shocked that when they reviewed the names, it was 2 young architects who have absolutely no track record, and they have no idea who they were. Actually, they won it. And
I think aghast was the word they used.
And that they were Singaporeans. But I think the other factor is pure perseverance that we have. I think we get knocked down, but we stand up again, and we will continue to go in the same direction. We don't turn back. And I think that may be the difference.
To any young aspiring architect out there who wants to be the next Summ or Richard, what do they need to succeed? And for that matter, how do you define success?
I guess success is maybe equivalent to no regrets. That if you had to do it all again, you would probably follow the same path. And so I think for us, it's definitely the case. I do think you have to be pretty single-minded. I think if your key aim in life is to, put down a deposit on your apartment and set up a cozy little life, is probably not the right move, maybe to take some risky business decisions and do a lot of unpaid work. So it is in some ways a calling and a mission where we're prepared to divert a lot of our resources to the exploration of ideas. So that is quite a challenge. But there's certainly lots of people who believe in things and want to do it. So I think the advice would be, it's possible. Don't think it's impossible to have a mission and follow it and be tenacious about it. It's just that, like anything else, you've got to balance your resources. If you put a lot of resources into that, you may not have resources for something else.
Summ?
I'm not sure the word vocabulary of success gels with me. I'm not quite sure we are successful at what we do. Well, I'm not sure we see ourselves as successful. We're still trying. We're still doing what we do all the time. So we're not sitting back and say, okay, we are successful and we now can rest on our laurels and to retire. But we still, going against the flow and still trying to reach new targets and goals. So I'm not quite sure whether that term successful is applicable to us. Maybe that's something for people to decide after we are long gone, perhaps.
Maybe it's better just to say we feel like we've made some progress in the direction that we'd like to take things.
Some, yes.
Some, but not a lot.
The secret to progress, not success. The secret to progress then is single-mindedness in a sense, and a deep restlessness, a constant search for new things and new frontiers. Apart from the things that you have tried to do through your work, what are the things that you think need to happen to get us to the world that we talk about, that we imagine?
For me, I think we need to see ourselves as part of nature. We must coexist with nature, and maybe we need to place nature before humans at the moment.
So a reprioritization, a new mindset about our place in the natural world.
I think one thing that would be really nice is the experience we've started to happen in Singapore, where we're putting out ideas, we're innovating, we're creating prototypes, and it's followed fairly closely behind by legislation or changes in regulation, which basically ratchet up the baseline of what's expected. I think that's what we really need to get somewhere where we need to be fairly quickly. So I like the idea of this sort of ratcheting baseline that follows closely behind innovation. And I think that if that was something that was applied worldwide, it really will drive up the bulk of developments, to get somewhere much closer to where we need to be much quicker, because you'll only ever get less than 1% probably of construction as with people who want to innovate behind it. Everyone else just wants a level playing field, get on with doing their jobs professionally. So that definition of what's professional and what is the minimum you can do, I think needs to be constantly improving.
So to change the DNA of policy and codes and how we do things as a collective rather than these individual symbolic projects. Brilliant. Thank you both for taking the time to be with us, for sharing your insights and visions. And to you, our listeners, for joining us today. Now, if you've enjoyed this episode and would like to hear more, subscribe to EcoGradia on any directory or listening app where you find your podcasts. You can also find all our episodes and related notes at ecogradia.com. And don't forget to follow us on social media and recommend us to friends and colleagues. I want to thank the good people at the Summ Foundation for Sustainable Construction, our sponsor for this episode. Check out their vast library of information and resources, the great work that they do, at wholesomfoundation.org, and look out for the announcement and details of the upcoming 7th cycle of the Wholesome Awards. And finally, a big shout out to the team who worked hard to put this episode together. Ecogradia's producer Maxim Flores, editorial assistants Anne Matthews and Amulia Doripala, our sound engineer and editor Kelvin Brown at Phlogiston. Thank you guys. Until we meet next, this is Nirmal Krishnani signing off in Singapore.